I got pregnant in 11th grade, and my parents kicked me out of the house in the middle of a blizzard. 18 years later, they crashed my charity gala, with a tabloid reporter dropping to their knees and demanding to meet their grandson. But my response caught the entire city by surprise. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. I am Savannah, 35 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of a private equity firm in Austin, Texas. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and the ballroom of the Driscoll Hotel hummed with the quiet, expensive sound of clinking crystal and murmured conversations. I was hosting our firm's annual philanthropic gala, an event that had taken 6 months of meticulous planning. The room was filled with city officials, hospital board members, and some of the wealthiest investors in the state. I stood near the center of the room, wearing a tailored emerald gown, holding a glass of sparkling water, and discussing the city's new infrastructure initiative with the mayor. Everything was perfect. The lighting was flawless. The string quartet played softly in the background, and my firm was on track to break a new fundraising record for the Children's Hospital. I had spent the last 18 years building this life brick by brick. After being thrown out of my childhood home with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes, I had lived in my car, worked 3 jobs, and clawed my way through college and the financial sector. I built my private equity firm from the ground up, turning it into a ruthless but highly respected powerhouse. I had constructed a fortress of success and stability for myself and my son Mason. I thought the walls of my new life were impenetrable. I was wrong. Right as the mayor was complimenting my firm's latest venture, a loud, jarring crash echoed through the ballroom. A tray of champagne flutes had shattered against the marble floor near the entrance. The string quartet faltered and stopped playing. Hundreds of guests turned their heads toward the commotion. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom had been shoved wide open, bypassing the velvet ropes and the guest check-in desk. My stomach dropped. Pushing her way through the crowd of stunned guests was my mother Patricia. Right behind her was my father Thomas. They were not alone. Trailing eagerly behind them was a man holding a large professional broadcasting camera with the logo of a local tabloid news network glowing on the side. A reporter with a microphone was practically stepping on my mother's heels, his eyes darting around the room, hungry for a scandal. My parents looked entirely out of place among the evening gowns and tuxedos. My mother wore an overly dramatic black dress that looked like it belonged at a funeral, her hair slightly disheveled to complete the picture of a distraught woman. My father wore a cheap suit, his face flushed red as he aggressively shoved past a waiter. I had not seen or spoken to these people in almost 2 decades. The last time I saw my mother, she was locking the front door of our house while I stood shivering on the porch, crying and holding my pregnant belly. Now here they were, storming into the pinnacle of my professional achievement. Before my security team could intercept them, my mother spotted me. She let out a loud theatrical wail that pierced the quiet ballroom. She practically threw herself forward, dropping to her knees on the expensive rug just a few feet away from me. The cameraman immediately rushed forward, angling his lens to capture her tear-stained face and my shocked expression. "Savannah!" My mother screamed, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "How can you stand there in designer clothes while you cruelly hide our only grandson from us?" The entire ballroom froze. The mayor took a slow, awkward step backward. Whispers erupted among the investors and city officials. My mother buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with loud sobs. 18 years, Savannah!" she wailed, looking up at the camera to make sure it caught her best angle. "You have kept that innocent boy away from his loving family for 18 years. We have begged, we have cried, and we just want to see the boy. Please just let us meet our grandson." My father stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder and looking at me with a perfectly practiced expression of paternal disappointment. He turned to the reporter, ensuring the microphone caught his words. "We sacrificed everything for her. We gave her a beautiful childhood, and this is how she repays us. By erasing us from our grandson's life. We are desperate. That is why we had to come here tonight. We just want to heal our family." For a fraction of a second, the terrified 17-year-old girl inside me wanted to run. I felt the familiar sting of panic, the ghost of their old power over me. But then I remembered who I was. I was not a helpless teenager anymore. I was a woman who managed billions of dollars in assets. I negotiated with ruthless corporate titans for a living. I did not cower. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I looked at the mayor, offered a polite smile, and handed my glass of water to a nearby waiter. Then I smoothly raised my right hand, catching the eye of my head of private security, who was already sprinting across the room. I gave him a subtle hand signal to stand down for just a moment. I needed to handle this myself. I stepped forward, my heels clicking softly against the floor. I looked down at my mother, who was still kneeling and pretending to sob. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the emotional distress they were hoping to provoke. You did not seem interested in him when you threw my trash bags onto the front lawn in the middle of a December blizzard. I said, my voice cold, steady, and loud enough for the camera to catch every single syllable. My mother's fake sobbing hitched. She looked up at me, genuine surprise flashing in her eyes. She had expected me to panic, to cry, or to drag her away from the cameras. She had not expected me to confront the truth head on. I turned my gaze to my father. You did not seem interested in healing our family when you explicitly told me that my teenage pregnancy was an embarrassment. I continued, my tone completely conversational, but laced with absolute ice. You told the neighbors I had run away to join a cult. You abandoned me on the street because my pregnancy threatened the optics of my older brother Jason and his precious golf scholarship. You chose a country club membership over your own daughter and your unborn grandson. My father's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but I did not let him. I turned directly to the tabloid reporter, who was looking slightly nervous, but still held the microphone out. I do not know how much they paid you for this little stunt, I told the reporter, locking eyes with the lens. But if you broadcast one single second of this trespassing on your network, my legal team will own your entire station by sunrise. We will sue for defamation, trespassing, and harassment. I will personally ensure your network is bankrupt and you are looking for a new career before your morning segment airs. Do you understand me? The reporter swallowed hard, lowering the microphone immediately. He signaled the cameraman to stop recording, stepping back toward the exit. The bluff had been called, and the power dynamic in the room had instantly shifted. With the camera lowered, my mother scrambled to her feet, dropping the grieving grandmother act entirely. Her face twisted into a mask of pure familiar rage. You ungrateful little brat, she hissed, pointing a shaking finger at me. You have no right to speak to us that way. We are your parents. We have rights. We will take that boy from you. I gave my security chief the final nod. 4 large men in dark suits descended upon my parents. Escort them out, I instructed quietly. If they resist, call the police and press charges for trespassing and public disturbance. My father started shouting threats, his face turning purple as 2 security guards grabbed his arms. My mother thrashed against the guards, holding her, screaming that I was a monster and that this was not over. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as the 2 people who had given me life were dragged out of the venue, their shouts echoing down the hallway until the heavy oak doors finally clicked shut behind them. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle over the room. I smoothed the front of my gown, turned back to the mayor, and offered a polite smile. I apologize for the interruption, I said smoothly. Shall we continue our discussion about the hospital wing? The party slowly resumed, the string quartet starting up a new melody. But as I took a fresh glass of water from a passing tray, my phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from a number I had not saved, but I recognized it instantly. It was my older brother, Jason. You should not have done that, the text read. Dad is filing for emergency grandparents' rights tomorrow morning. We are taking the kid. I stared at the glowing screen. They were coming for my son. After 18 years of silence, they were declaring war. The drive back to my penthouse in downtown Austin was silent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, reflecting off the glass like scattered diamonds. When the elevator doors opened directly into my foyer, I kicked off my emerald heels and walked barefoot across the cold hardwood floor toward the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The sharp carbonation burned my throat in a good way, grounding me back in reality. Before I could take a second sip, my phone lit up on the marble island. The screen displayed a text message from a number I had blocked on my personal phone years ago, but this was my emergency corporate line. Only my executive team and family members desperate enough to dig through public business registries had this number. The name at the top of the message read Jason, my older brother, the golden child whose pristine golf scholarship had been the reason I was discarded like trash 18 years ago. I did not want to read it, but ignoring a threat never neutralized it. I tapped the screen and opened the message. You made a massive mistake humiliating mom and dad like that in public. You think your money makes you untouchable, but you are wrong. They are filing for emergency grandparents' rights tomorrow morning at the county courthouse. We are going to force a relationship with Mason. You cannot keep him from his real family anymore. We are taking the boy. I stared at the glowing text. They really believed they could waltz into a courtroom and demand access to an 18-year-old legal adult. The sheer entitlement was almost laughable, but the underlying threat of a media circus was entirely real. I locked the screen and tossed the phone back onto the counter. I did not reply. Engaging with Jason was a losing game. It only gave him the attention he craved. Instead, I picked up my water and walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the guest wing. I knocked twice on the heavy wooden door at the end of the hall and pushed it open. Mason was sitting at his large mahogany desk, surrounded by open finance textbooks and highlighted printouts of market analyses. At 18, my son was already a freshman at the university, carrying himself with a quiet intensity that rivaled seasoned executives twice his age. He had my sharp jawline and focused eyes, but his calm demeanor was entirely his own. I was not looking at his textbooks right now. His laptop screen was brightly illuminated, replaying a shaky cell phone recorded video of the gala. The audio was low, but I could clearly hear my mother dropping to her knees and wailing for her grandson. Mason paused the video as I walked in. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He wore a simple gray sweater, looking completely relaxed despite the digital chaos unfolding on his screen. They are already trending on local news boards, he said, his voice smooth and steady. Someone posted the footage to social media about 20 minutes ago. The comments are split. Half the people think you are a cold corporate monster keeping a boy from his loving grandparents. The other half think they looked like amateur actors auditioning for a daytime soap opera. I took a sip of my water and leaned against his doorframe. I am sorry you had to see that, Mason. I had security escort them out as quickly as possible, but they brought a tabloid reporter with them. They wanted a public spectacle. Mason let out a short, dry laugh. A spectacle is right. It is funny how they are suddenly desperate to meet the grandson they threw away before he was even born. They are filing for emergency visitation rights tomorrow morning, I told him, watching his reaction. Jason just texted me. They want to force a relationship with you through the courts. Mason shook his head, a genuine smile breaking through his serious expression. I am 18 years old. I can legally buy a house, sign a contract, and vote. A judge is going to laugh them out of the courtroom. Do they not have lawyers advising them on basic age of majority laws? They do not care about the legal reality, I explained, walking further into his room and sitting on the edge of his neatly made bed. They care about the optics. They want to drag this out in the press. They want to paint me as the villain who alienated you, hoping I will write them a massive settlement check just to make the bad publicity go away. They want money, Mason. They do not care about a grandson. They never have. Mason turned his chair to face me fully. His expression hardened, losing the trace of humor it held a moment ago. He knew the truth about his grandparents. I had never hidden my past from him, choosing to raise him with absolute honesty, rather than sheltering him with comfortable lies. Emotional distress, he said flatly, gesturing to the paused video on his screen. Is that what they are going to claim in their lawsuit? Because I am pretty sure true emotional distress is forcing your 17-year-old daughter to pack her entire life into garbage bags and locking her out in the freezing rain. I looked down at my hands, the memory of that bitter December night flashing vividly in my mind. The wind had been howling, biting through my thin jacket as my mother deadbolted the front door. I had begged them to let me stay just until the morning, but my father had simply drawn the curtains shut. Or maybe emotional distress is living in the back seat of a beat-up sedan. For 6 months, I replied, my voice steady, but tight with old anger. While I was wrapping myself in moving blankets to keep you warm in my belly, they were hosting celebration dinners for Jason, making the varsity golf team. Mason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. They told the entire neighborhood you ran away to join a religious cult. I saw the old Facebook posts when I did a deep dive on them last year. They literally told their country club friends that you stole money from my grandfather's safe and vanished into the night. They spun this whole narrative of being heartbroken, betrayed parents to get sympathy from the community. It was easier for them to play the victims than to admit they threw their pregnant daughter onto the street to protect their social standing, I said. They cared more about what the neighbors thought of Jason's athletic career than they cared about whether we survived the winter. I survived because I had to. I worked 3 minimum wage jobs, sleeping in the break room of a diner between shifts. I saved every crumpled dollar bill to pay for a tiny studio apartment before you were born. And while Jason was failing his college classes and wrecking the cars my father bought him, I was clawing my way through night school, learning everything I could about finance, investments, and wealth management. I built my empire with the very hands they left out in the cold. Mason looked at me, his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering respect. You built a fortress, Mom, and they are outside throwing pebbles at the gates. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my gown. Let them throw pebbles. Tomorrow morning we are going to show them exactly what happens when you try to breach these walls. By 8:30 the next morning, I was back at my corporate headquarters in downtown Austin. The emerald gown and gala lights were gone. I wore a charcoal suit, my hair pulled back, and sat at the head of the smaller legal conference room with a fresh cup of coffee cooling beside my hand. Across from me, David, my lead corporate attorney, placed a thick cream-colored folder on the table. 2 members of his litigation team sat beside him with laptops already open. Nobody wasted time on sympathy. They filed at 7:42 this morning, David said. He slid the folder toward me. Thomas and Patricia are asking the court for emergency grandparents visitation, an injunction preventing you from interfering with their relationship with Mason, emotional damages and compensation for 18 years of what they call intentional family alienation. I opened the petition and scanned the first page. My mother's name appeared above a paragraph describing her as a devastated grandmother who had been cruelly deprived of a relationship with an innocent child. My father claimed severe emotional distress, sleeplessness, humiliation, and damage to his reputation. Their lawyer had attached screenshots from the gala and a transcript of Jason's threat-filled version of our family history. It was designed to look urgent, tragic, and expensive. And the visitation request? I asked. David almost smiled. Dead on arrival. Mason turned 18 months ago. He is a legal adult in Texas. There is no custody order to modify, no minor child for the court to place on a visitation schedule, and no emergency mechanism that lets grandparents force an adult man to spend time with them. If Mason tells the court he does not want contact, that portion of the petition collapses before it gets through the door. One of the associates rotated her laptop toward me. Mason's date of birth was highlighted beside the statutory references their filing had tried to invoke. Their attorney knows that, she said. The age problem is obvious, which means the visitation language is probably not the real objective. I kept reading. Halfway through the filing, the tone changed. The emotional language gave way to numbers. They demanded compensation for lost holidays, travel gifts. They claimed they had purchased counseling costs they claimed to have incurred, and reputational damage supposedly caused by my statements at the gala. The requested amount was not listed as a fixed figure. Instead, the petition asked for damages to be determined at trial and invited settlement discussions immediately. That was the line that mattered. They want me at a negotiating table, I said. David nodded. That is my read. They cannot take Mason. They know they cannot take Mason. But they can generate filings, hearings, press coverage, discovery disputes, and ugly headlines. They can make the process expensive and public. Then they can offer to disappear in exchange for money. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the glass wall at the trading floor beyond the conference room. Analysts were already moving between desks, screens glowing with market data. My family had spent 18 years pretending I did not exist. Now they had hired lawyers, brought cameras into my gala, and filed a lawsuit before breakfast. People did not reverse 18 years of indifference because they suddenly discovered love. They reversed course because something had changed. How fast could you get this dismissed? I asked. The visitation portion very fast. The damages theories are weak too, but civil claims can be kept alive long enough to create noise if the plaintiffs are willing to spend money. We can attack the entire filing now and probably shorten the circus. I closed the folder. Do not kill it yet. David's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew me well enough to hear the strategy behind the sentence. You want them to keep spending. I want them to keep talking, I corrected. Yesterday they ambushed a charity gala with a reporter. Last night Jason threatened to take an 18-year-old man through grandparents' rights. This morning they filed a lawsuit they know cannot give them the thing they claim to want. None of that makes sense unless the lawsuit is leverage for something else. I tapped the damages page with one finger. This is not a family reconciliation effort. It is a pressure campaign. They expect the bad publicity to frighten my investors and my board. Then they expect me to write a check large enough to make the embarrassment disappear. David folded his hands. How large? Large enough that humiliating themselves publicly is worth it. The room went quiet. I had grown up around Thomas and Patricia's obsession with appearances. They measured success in invitations, country club tables, cars in the driveway, and the names of people who returned their calls. My mother would rather endure physical pain than let a neighbor see her embarrassed. My father had thrown his pregnant daughter into a blizzard because my existence threatened the clean little story he wanted to tell about his family. Those people did not voluntarily kneel on a ballroom floor in front of cameras, unless the alternative terrified them more. Something is wrong financially, I said. I do not know what yet, but this smells like a liquidity problem. David glanced toward the other attorneys. With them personally. With the family, with Jason's company, or both. 5 years ago, my father handed Texas Star Logistics to Jason. Since then, Jason has lived like the company prints money. Sports cars, private travel, the Dallas Mansion Country Club dues. I have never believed the numbers behind his lifestyle. Now suddenly all three of them are willing to turn themselves into a public spectacle for a settlement. I want to know what deadline they are racing. I pushed the petition back across the table. File enough to block any emergency relief. Make it unmistakably clear that Mason is an adult and that no judge is going to order him into a grandparent relationship. But do not give them a clean, immediate ending on the damages claim. Request documents. Challenge standing where appropriate. Force them to particularize every dollar they say I cost them. Make them explain every alleged gift, every alleged counseling bill, every supposed loss. I want this case moving slowly enough that they think the pressure campaign is still alive. David gave a short nod. And while they are focused on the lawsuit, I find out why they need the money. My phone vibrated against the table. Mason had sent a message from campus. Already told my professors I may have security nearby for a while. I am fine. Do what you need to do. I stared at the words for a second, then locked the screen. They had already dragged my son into their performance once. I was not going to let them use him as a bargaining chip twice. One more thing, I said. No public apology, no settlement outreach, no statement that sounds defensive. If reporters call, we say the matter is being handled by counsel and nothing else. I want my parents to believe the noise is working, but I do not want to feed it. David stood and gathered the petition. Understood. We hold the legal line, slow the damages fight, and give you room to investigate. Exactly. The attorneys left the room carrying the folder with them. I remained at the table for another minute watching Austin wake up beyond the windows. My parents thought they had opened a legal front that would force me backward. What they had actually done was hand me the first piece of evidence that their sudden love for Mason had a price tag attached to it. I did not know the number yet. I did not know the debt, the fraud, or the deadline waiting behind their performance. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Jason would not stay quiet for long. If the lawsuit failed to scare me into paying, he would find a louder stage. The confirmation of my fears came the following afternoon. I was sitting in my corner office reviewing the prospectus for our upcoming flagship tech fund. It was a massive venture, a multi-billion-dollar portfolio that would cement my firm as a premier player in the national market. The heavy glass door of my office swung open, and my public relations director, a sharp woman named Jasmine, walked in. Her face was unusually pale. She carried an open tablet and placed it directly over my paperwork. "You need to see this right now," she said, her voice tight with professional panic. I looked down at the screen. It was a video clip from a highly popular local business podcast, a show hosted by an entrepreneur known for his controversial takes. Across from the host sat Jason, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking every bit the successful concerned older brother. I watched in cold silence as he performed. He leaned into the microphone, his voice thick with manufactured grief. "We gave her everything," Jason was saying, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. "My parents sacrificed their entire lives to give Savannah a golden childhood. We paid for tutors, we supported her dreams, and she just turned her back on us the second she got a taste of real money." The host leaned forward, eating up the drama. "And your nephew?" the host asked. "You have not seen him?" Jason shook his head, looking down at his hands as if overwhelmed by sorrow. 18 years. She has kept that innocent boy isolated from his real family. She is a ruthless, greedy woman who cares more about her corporate acquisitions than her own flesh and blood. She is sociopathic, honestly. My parents are completely broken. We just want our family back." I pushed the tablet away, feeling a sharp spike of disgust. The clip had already amassed hundreds of thousands of views. The comments beneath it were a toxic sludge of public outrage, calling for boycotts of my firm and demanding I be investigated for child endangerment. Jason had expertly weaponized the internet against me. It did not take long for the public backlash to bleed into my professional reality. By noon, my office phone was ringing constantly. Jasmine was fielding calls from local news stations, but the real crisis was happening on my private line. The flagship tech fund I had spent years building relied heavily on conservative institutional investors. These were massive pension funds that hated public scandal. They thrived on stability and pristine public images. My executive assistant transferred a call from Harrison Caldwell, the managing director of our largest institutional backer. Savannah, Harrison said, skipping the usual pleasantries. "My board is looking at this podcast clip. It is everywhere. Private equity is built on trust. And right now, you are being painted as an unstable, vindictive woman who emotionally abuses her elderly parents. That is not the kind of leadership we can associate with a $2 billion fund." I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to let my anger bleed into the negotiation. "Harrison, you and I both know that internet gossip has absolutely zero bearing on my financial acumen or the projected returns of this fund. My personal life is being manipulated by estranged relatives looking for a handout. You have seen my track record. I deliver results. I do not care about your family drama," Savannah Harrison countered sharply. "I care about optics. My clients do not want to see their money managed by someone trending on social media for elder abuse. We are pausing our commitment to the fund until this situation is resolved. If this circus continues through the weekend, we are pulling out entirely." The phone line immediately went dead. The threat of losing our anchor investor sent an immediate shockwave through my corporate hierarchy. Less than an hour after Harrison hung up on me, my board of directors called an emergency meeting. I walked into the glass-walled boardroom to find 12 seasoned executives looking at me with anxious expressions. At the head of the table sat my chairman, William. "Savannah, this has gone too far," William said, tapping a printed summary of the media fallout on the polished mahogany table. "The public sentiment is turning aggressively against us. We are hemorrhaging goodwill, and if Harrison pulls his capital, 3 other major backers will follow. The flagship fund will collapse." I took my seat, looking around the room. "What exactly are you suggesting, William?" "You need to issue a public apology," he said smoothly, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Draft a press release. Say that emotions were high at the gala, that you deeply regret the misunderstanding with your parents. Cut them a check. Pay them a settlement for emotional distress. Make them sign a non-disclosure agreement. And make this podcast nightmare go away. Smooth things over so we can close the fund." I looked at the 12 men and women who had profited immensely from my relentless work ethic over the years. They wanted me to bow to the people who had left me to freeze in a car. They wanted me to hand over millions of dollars to the brother who had orchestrated my teenage misery, all to save face. I stood up, placing my hands flat on the cool wood of the conference table. I am not apologizing to the people who threw me onto the street, I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the quiet room. I am not paying a single cent in extortion money to my brother, and I am not issuing a press release that validates their lies. William frowned, his face reddening. Savannah, you are letting personal pride jeopardize billions of dollars. You need to trust my process, I told him, meeting his angry gaze without flinching. This is not about a desperate family missing a grandson. This is a targeted, coordinated shakedown, and I am going to find out exactly why they are suddenly so desperate for cash. The meeting is adjourned for now. I turned my back on the stunned executives and walked out of the glass boardroom without waiting for their response. My heels sank into the plush carpet of the executive hallway, but my mind was already moving 10 steps ahead of them. William and the board were reacting out of fear, viewing this entirely as a public relations crisis. They saw a grieving family and a damaged corporate image. But I knew the people who raised me. My parents and my brother did not do anything simply because their feelings were hurt. They were incredibly vain, deeply calculating, and fiercely protective of their social status. A public media tour was beneath them, unless there was a tangible, desperate motivation driving it. I needed to find out what that motivation was. I walked into my corner office and shut the heavy door behind me, sealing out the anxious murmurs of the corporate floor. I walked straight to my desk, picked up my secure internal phone, and pressed a single button. The line rang only once before it was answered. I need Mitchell in my office right now, I told my assistant. Tell him to bring his best people and prepare for a long night. We are pulling a full financial autopsy. Less than 5 minutes later, Mitchell stepped into my office. He was the head of my firm's forensic accounting division, a quiet, meticulously observant man who could find a hidden dollar in a maze of 10,000 shell companies. Behind him trailed two of his top senior analysts, both carrying secure laptops and looking entirely unfazed by the sudden summons. Take a seat, I told them, gesturing to the leather chairs surrounding the sleek conference table at the far end of my office. Mitchell sat down, opening his laptop immediately. What is the target, Savannah? I walked over to the windows, looking out at the Texas Capitol building, glowing against the darkening evening sky. The target is a regional supply chain and freight business based out of Dallas, I said, turning to face them. It is called Texas Star Logistics. It is privately held, entirely family-owned, and the current chief executive officer is my older brother, Jason. Mitchell did not react to the personal connection. He simply began typing, pulling up the initial public registry files. What are we looking for? We are looking for a fire, I explained, walking over to the table and taking a seat across from him. 5 years ago, my father handed that company over to Jason on a silver platter. It was a completely debt-free, highly profitable regional business that my father spent 3 decades building. But I know my brother. Jason has the ego of a billionaire, but the actual business acumen of a college freshman. He likes to play the role of the self-made titan, but he lacks the discipline to actually run a company with razor-thin margins. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany wood of the table. I have been watching him from a distance for years. Jason lives in a $7 million mansion in a gated community. He drives a new imported sports car every 6 months. He maintains elite country club memberships, takes his family on private chartered vacations to Europe twice a year, and throws extravagant parties. The lifestyle he projects requires an enormous steady stream of liquid cash. But the freight and logistics market has taken a massive hit over the last 3 years. Fuel costs are up, supply chains are squeezed, and regional carriers are struggling to break even. One of the analysts looked up from his screen. So the math does not make sense. The math has never made sense, I confirmed. Jason is currently paying for a massive public relations campaign to smear my name across the state. He is hiring top-tier media consultants and lawyers to file frivolous lawsuits against me. That kind of aggressive, highly public attack costs serious money. But more importantly, It costs pride. My family would never willingly humiliate themselves on a local podcast unless they were absolutely desperate for a massive immediate cash settlement from me. I need to know why they need that cash. I need you to rip that company apart digit by digit. Mitchell nodded his eyes, already scanning the initial data streams. We will start with the public filings, property records, and vendor networks. If he is bleeding cash, he is hiding it somewhere. We will work through the night. I am staying right here with you, I told him. Whatever you find, I want to see the raw data the second you uncover it. For the next several hours, my office transformed into a silent, high-stakes command center. The sun completely disappeared, plunging the city of Austin into darkness, leaving only the ambient glow of the streetlights and the bright, sterile light of the computer monitors illuminating the room. I ordered coffee and food for the team, though none of us ate much. The air was thick with focused, intense concentration. I sat at my desk, reviewing my own portfolio, while occasionally pacing the length of the room. Every time I looked at the dark windows, I thought about Jason sitting in a podcast studio, weaponizing my painful history to paint himself as a victim. I thought about my parents putting on a theatrical performance of grief at my gala. They had always operated under the assumption that they were the smartest people in the room. They believed that because I was their daughter, they could still control me through shame and public pressure. They had severely underestimated the woman I had become. Around 11 o'clock at night, the quiet rhythm of the room shifted. Mitchell stopped typing. He leaned closer to his screen, his brow furrowing as he highlighted a long column of numbers. He murmured something to the analyst sitting next to him, who quickly began cross-referencing a different database. "What is it?" I asked, walking over to stand behind Mitchell's chair. Mitchell pointed to a complex spreadsheet displaying vendor payouts for Texas Star Logistics. When we look at standard logistics companies of this size, we expect to see a very predictable ratio of revenue going toward vehicle maintenance, fuel providers, and driver payroll. But look at this specific vendor category right here. He highlighted a group of 6 different consulting firms that had been receiving massive recurring monthly payments from Jason's company over the last 4 years. The payments were categorized as operational consulting and strategic management fees. Those payments represent nearly 30% of their total operating budget. Mitchell explained, his voice low and serious. That is incredibly high for a regional freight business. So we dug into those 6 consulting firms. "And what did you find?" I asked, my heart rate beginning to pick up. The analyst spoke up next. "They are ghost companies. Every single one of them is registered to a single post office box in Delaware. They have no actual employees, no digital footprint, and no record of providing any tangible services to anyone in the logistics industry." Mitchell brought up a new screen showing a web of financial routing. "We tracked the payments going into those Delaware accounts. The money does not stay there. Within 24 hours of the deposits clearing, the funds are immediately wired to a series of offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands." I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in the dark glass of my office windows. The silence in the room was absolute. I looked at Mitchell, waiting for him to confirm what I was already thinking. "You are telling me my brother is embezzling from his own company?" I said, my voice dangerously calm. Mitchell nodded slowly. "He is not just embezzling, Savannah. He is systematically draining the operational capital of Texas Star Logistics and hiding it behind international privacy laws. Based on the routing numbers and the corporate registry in Delaware, Jason is the sole managing director of those 6 consulting firms. He is approving payments from the family business to his own ghost companies and then washing the money offshore." "How long has this been going on?" I asked, walking around the table to look closer at the cascading rows of data. The analyst on the left tapped her keyboard, bringing up a historical timeline. "The ghost payments started 3.5 years ago," she said, "but the volume of the transfers doubled rapidly in the last 8 months. He is accelerating the drain. It looks like a desperate cash grab." "A desperate cash grab means a looming deadline," I thought aloud, piecing the corporate puzzle together. "You do not accelerate offshore transfers unless the ship is actively sinking and you are trying to fill the lifeboats before anyone else notices the water." I turned back to Mitchell. "I need you to pull their debt obligations. Look at their commercial lines of credit, their outstanding vendor invoices. and any business loans my father might have co-signed when he handed the company over. I want to know exactly how much water the ship is taking on. Mitchell and his two analysts dove back into the databases. The quiet clicking of keyboards filled the room for another 45 minutes. I paced the length of my office drinking cold coffee, feeling the adrenaline burn away my exhaustion. I had known my family was toxic. I had known they were manipulative and obsessed with their social standing. But corporate fraud on a federal level was a completely different breed of arrogance. Jason was actively committing a crime that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. Savannah Mitchell finally said, breaking the heavy silence, "You need to see this." I walked back to the conference table. Mitchell turned his laptop toward me. The screen displayed a consolidated balance sheet for Texas Star Logistics, cross-referenced with regional banking records. The numbers were staggering. "They are completely insolvent," Mitchell explained, pointing to a highlighted red column at the bottom of the screen. Jason has leveraged the company against multiple commercial loans to cover the operational deficits caused by his embezzlement. They are defaulting on their fuel suppliers. They are behind on their vehicle fleet leases. The total accumulated toxic debt right now is $25 million. $25 million, I repeated, the sheer magnitude of the failure washing over me. How did a regional freight company even secure that much credit while bleeding cash? Banks have risk management departments. They would have cut the credit lines the moment the profit and loss statements dipped into the red. Mitchell brought up a scanned PDF of a commercial loan agreement. "That is the part that explains everything else," he said softly. "Jason did not secure these loans on the merit of the business. He used a guarantor." I leaned in, reading the signatures at the bottom of the digital document. There, in crisp black ink, were the signatures of Thomas and Patricia, my parents. They put up personal collateral. The analyst chimed in, pulling up the corresponding property records. "Your parents personally guaranteed the $25 million in commercial loans. They leveraged their entire estate in Dallas. They leveraged their retirement pensions, their stock portfolios, and their country club shares. Everything they own is legally bound to the survival of Texas Star Logistics. And since the company is defaulting," I said, the pieces finally clicking together with brutal clarity. Mitchell nodded grimly. "The bank is calling the debt. We found preliminary foreclosure notices filed in the county court system just 10 days ago. The bank is preparing to seize your parents' estate. Within a month, they are going to lose the mansion, the cars, the business, and every dime they have to their names. They are going to be completely bankrupt." I stood up slowly, stepping away from the conference table. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing my hand against the cool glass, looking out at the sleeping city. The realization hit me like a physical blow, heavy and suffocating, yet entirely illuminating. The last puzzle piece slid perfectly into place, revealing the true picture of my family's sudden reappearance in my life. This was never about Mason. For 18 years, they had not sent a single birthday card. They had completely erased my son from their reality because his existence was an inconvenience to their perfect country club image. And then out of nowhere, they crashed my charity gala. They dropped to their knees in front of rolling cameras, sobbing about how much they missed their only grandson. They filed an emergency lawsuit claiming severe emotional distress. Jason went on a popular podcast to paint me as a sociopathic daughter who tore a loving family apart. They did not care about knowing Mason. They did not miss him. They were terrified. They were staring down the barrel of total financial ruin and federal prison. Jason had stolen millions, and my parents were about to lose their entire identity to the bank. They had orchestrated the entire media circus as a calculated, desperate extortion attempt. They knew I managed a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. They knew I relied on the trust of conservative institutional investors. They staged the ambush, hoping the public relations nightmare would force my hand. They wanted me to panic. They expected me to offer them a massive, quiet cash settlement just to make the bad press go away. They wanted a quick $10 or $20 million under the guise of an emotional distress settlement, which they would immediately use to pay off the bank cover-up, Jason's embezzlement, and save their mansion. They were trying to use the daughter they threw away to fund their own salvation. A cold, dark anger settled deep in my chest. It was the calm, absolute fury of a woman who held the power to destroy them. Mitchell, I said, turning away from the window. My voice was stripped of all emotion, sounding completely analytical. I want every single document downloaded and secured on a hard drive. I want the routing numbers for the Cayman Island accounts. I want the foreclosure notices from the bank. I want a complete airtight dossier on Jason's corporate fraud and my parents' complicity in securing those fraudulent loans. Mitchell closed his laptop, understanding the gravity of the instruction. Consider it done, Savannah. We will have the full physical dossier on your desk by 6 o'clock this morning. Thank you, I told the team. You are all done for the night. Go home and get some sleep. The analysts packed up their secure equipment quietly, leaving my office one by one. Mitchell was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at me with a rare expression of sympathy. Are you going to be all right, Savannah? He asked. I looked at the stack of tech fund prospectuses sitting on my desk. I thought about the board members who had demanded I apologize. I thought about Harrison Caldwell threatening to pull his money. And then I thought about my parents sipping wine in their mansion, thinking they had outsmarted me. I am going to be fine, Mitchell, I said smoothly. But my family is about to have a very bad week. The heavy door clicked shut, and I was alone again. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone. It was almost 3 in the morning. The podcast clip was likely still gaining views, painting me as the villain in their manufactured tragedy. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I would play defense. I opened my contact list and dialed the direct number for my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring, sounding wide awake. Savannah, he said, his voice crisp. Tell me we have a strategy. We have much more than a strategy, I replied, sitting down in my leather chair. Keep the emotional damages claim exactly where we put it this morning. Slow procedural, and nowhere near a settlement conference. Now expand discovery. I want every financial record that could support the damages they claim, every counseling bill, every alleged gift, and every document showing why they suddenly need money. Do not let them accelerate the case while we are tracing the real motive behind it. The lawyer paused, catching the shift in my tone. You found something. I found the reason they are screaming for the cameras, I told him. They are bankrupt and facing federal fraud charges. They need a settlement from me to survive. So we keep starving them out. No settlement outreach and no public statement. Let the damages claim crawl while they burn money and confidence. The longer they believe the media pressure is their only leverage, the more desperate and careless they will become. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my heavy leather chair. The sun would be up in a few hours, bringing a new day of corporate battles and public scrutiny. But I was no longer fighting in the dark. I knew exactly what my family wanted, and I knew exactly how to make sure they never got it. My legal team expanded the procedural wall with flawless precision. By the time the courthouse opened the next morning, the existing response had been reinforced with targeted discovery requests and challenges aimed at every unsupported damages allegation. The emergency visitation theory was already crippled by the simple fact that Mason was 18 and the remaining civil claims were moving far too slowly to produce the quick settlement my family needed. They could not force me to write a check, and they could not turn their filing into immediate access to my son. Their extortion plan had hit a brick wall. Recognizing that they could not get through to me through lawyers or headlines, my parents and my brother bypassed the legal blockade entirely and went straight for the person they assumed was the weakest link. They went after my son. I would learn the exact details of their desperate ambush later that afternoon, when Mason recounted every single second of the encounter with absolute clarity. It happened on a crisp Thursday morning on the main campus of the university. Mason had just finished a challenging macroeconomics seminar. He walked out of the massive limestone lecture hall, his mind focused on an upcoming midterm examination. The campus quad was bustling with hundreds of college students hurrying between classes, drinking coffee and chatting in the bright autumn sunlight. But as Mason walked down the wide concrete steps toward the main courtyard, he noticed 3 people standing near the bronze fountain who looked entirely out of place. It was Thomas, Patricia, and Jason. They had clearly spent the morning tracking his class schedule, likely paying a private investigator or bribing a university faculty member to find out exactly where my son would be at 11 o'clock in the morning. They were dressed in carefully selected casual clothing, attempting to blend in, but their nervous energy radiated like a beacon. Mason recognized them instantly from the viral gala video and the countless hours we had spent discussing their past. I knew exactly who they were, and more importantly, he knew exactly what kind of financial ruin they were, desperately trying to escape. Instead of turning around or calling my security team, Mason kept walking directly toward them. He inherited my ability to remain perfectly calm under pressure. He simply adjusted his expression, replacing his sharp analytical focus with the mild, slightly confused look of an ordinary college freshman. He let them make the first move. Patricia spotted him first. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp that caused several nearby students to turn their heads. She practically sprinted across the concrete courtyard, her arms outstretched. Before Mason could even say a word, she threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight, suffocating hug. She buried her face in his shoulder and began to sob loudly. It was the exact same theatrical performance she had debuted at my charity gala, tailored specifically for a public audience. "Oh, my sweet boy," Patricia cried, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Look at you. You are so handsome. You look just like your uncle. We have missed you so much. We have waited 18 long years for this exact moment." Mason stood rigidly, allowing the hug but not returning it. He gently stepped back, creating a necessary physical boundary. He looked at the three of them, perfectly playing the role of a hesitant, overwhelmed young man. "I am sorry," Mason said, keeping his voice carefully polite. "Who are you?" Thomas stepped forward, placing a heavy, solemn hand on my mother's shoulder to steady her. He looked at Mason with an expression of deep, manufactured paternal sorrow. He played the role of the heartbroken patriarch flawlessly. "We are your grandparents," Mason Thomas said, his voice thick with fake regret. "And this is your Uncle Jason. We know this is a massive shock to you. We know your mother has likely told you terrible things about us. But we could not wait for the lawyers and the court system anymore. We simply had to see our grandson. We had to look you in the eyes and tell you the truth." Jason stepped up next, sliding his hands into the pockets of his expensive slacks. He offered Mason a warm, charismatic smile, the exact same smile he used to charm country club investors and hide his massive corporate fraud. "It is great to finally meet you, buddy," Jason said, using a casual, relatable tone. "We know Savannah has kept you locked away from us. We know she probably painted us as the villains in her story. But there are two sides to every coin. You are a smart kid going to a great business school. We figured you were old enough to hear the truth and make up your own mind about your family." Mason shifted his weight, looking down at the ground, putting on a masterclass in feigned vulnerability. "What truth?" he asked quietly. Patricia stepped closer, reaching out to gently touch Mason's arm. Her eyes were wide and pleading. "The truth is that we never stopped loving you, Mason. For 18 years we tried to be part of your life. We sent you birthday cards every single year. We bought you Christmas presents, bicycles, books, and clothes. We sent letters begging your mother to let us visit. We set up college funds for you. But Savannah sent everything back. She intercepted our letters. She returned the gifts in the mail. She changed her phone numbers and threatened to call the police if we ever came near her house. She is a deeply bitter, angry woman, and she punished us by keeping you totally isolated from the people who love you most." It was a breathtaking web of lies. They stood in the middle of a college campus and spun a completely fabricated narrative of relentless devotion. They had never sent a single card. They had never purchased a single gift. They had never once tried to contact me until they realized I was wealthy and staring down the barrel of $25 million in toxic debt. They were trying to poison my son against me, hoping to use a teenager's natural curiosity to wedge their way into my financial fortress. Mason looked up at them, his eyes wide, pretending to process the heavy emotional revelation. "Why would she do that?" he asked, his voice wavering just enough to sell the performance. "Because she has always been jealous of this family," Jason interjected smoothly. "She resented that Mom and Dad expected her to follow the rules. When she got pregnant, she chose to run away rather than accept our help. She wanted to punish us, But you should not have to pay the price for your mother's stubborn pride. You deserve to know where you come from. You deserve your birthright. Patricia reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a dark velvet jewelry box. She pressed it gently into Mason's hands, opening the lid to reveal a stunning vintage gold watch resting on silk. "We wanted you to have this," she whispered tearfully. "We just want to be your real loving family. It belonged to your great-grandfather. He always hoped his only grandson would wear it with absolute pride." Mason stared down at the vintage gold watch resting on the white silk lining of the velvet box. He kept his expression perfectly balanced between shock and quiet gratitude. The watch was a heavy, ornate piece gleaming in the midday campus sun. He knew exactly what it was. It was an expensive bribe, a calculated prop designed to buy his loyalty and distract him from the sudden, desperate nature of their visit. He reached out and gently took the watch from the box, turning it over in his hands as if he were holding something sacred. "Thank you," Mason said, his voice dropping slightly to convey a sense of genuine emotional weight. "It is beautiful. I do not even know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," Patricia replied, reaching out to squeeze his arm. Her eyes were welling with fresh, perfectly timed tears. "You just have to know that you belong with us. You always have." Jason took a step forward, smoothly transitioning the dynamic of the conversation. He recognized that Patricia had established the emotional hook, and now it was time for him to reel the target in. He clapped a heavy, familiar hand on his shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. He projected the aura of a highly successful, confident mentor, offering guidance to a young protege. "It is a lot to take in, buddy," Jason said, offering a warm, charismatic smile. "We know that, but blood is thicker than water. That is what this family has always believed. Your mother might have chosen to walk away from her roots, but that does not mean you have to. You are a grown man now. You are studying finance at a top university. You are smart enough to look at the big picture and see what is really on the table right here." Mason looked up from the watch, meeting the gaze of Jason with wide, attentive eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked, playing the role of the curious, impressionable college student flawlessly. Jason slipped his hands into the pockets of his expensive slacks, leaning in just a fraction to create a sense of intimacy and importance. "I am talking about your future, Mason. I am talking about the family legacy. Our dad built a massive logistics empire from the ground up, and I took over the operations to expand our reach across the region. We are doing incredible things, and we have always intended for you to be a part of it. When you were born, my parents set up a private family trust. It has been sitting there growing and compounding for 18 years. There are millions of dollars in that account, Mason. Millions. And it is completely yours." The sheer audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. Mason knew the forensic accounting risks, backward and forward. He knew that the family logistics company was drowning in $25 million of toxic debt, and he knew that there was no secret trust fund waiting for him. There was only a desperate sinking ship, and Jason was trying to hand him a bucket. "Are you serious?" Mason asked, letting a trace of awe slip into his tone. "Mom always told me we had to build everything ourselves. She said you never wanted anything to do with us." Jason shook his head, looking down with a practiced expression of deep disappointment. "Savannah has a twisted perspective on reality. She is fiercely independent, and we respect that she built her own firm, but she let her pride turn into bitterness. She wanted to prove she did not need us, so she cut you off from your rightful inheritance. But you are 18 now. The trust is legally yours to access, and we want to give you much more than just a bank account." Thomas stepped closer, nodding in agreement with his son. "We want to give you a seat at the table, Mason. You have the family mind for business. We want you to join the board of directors for Texas Star Logistics." Mason let his jaw drop just a fraction. "A seat on the board? I am only a freshman. I just started taking my core business classes." "That is exactly why you need to be in the boardroom," Jason countered smoothly. "You are young, hungry, and full of fresh ideas. We need that kind of energy. You can learn the ropes of running a massive corporate enterprise while you finish your degree. By the time you graduate, you will already be an established executive with a seven-figure net worth. You will have a corner office waiting for you in Dallas." Patricia smiled brightly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "We just want to see you succeed, sweetie. We want to give you the world your mother tried to hide from you. Mason looked down at the gold watch again, letting out a slow, overwhelmed breath. It was a masterful performance. He looked like a young man whose entire worldview had just been shifted, dazzled by the promise of easy wealth and corporate prestige. It is an incredible offer, he said hesitantly. But my mom is going to hate this. She does not even want me talking to you. Jason smiled, sensing that he had successfully hooked his target. That is exactly why we need your help, Mason. Your mother is a brilliant private equity manager, but she is completely blinded by her grudge against us. We want to heal this family, we really do. And we think you are the key to making that happen. How Mason asked. Jason leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a confidential business-like level. We need a bridge between our family company and the firm of your mother. If you step up and take your seat on the board, you can facilitate a strategic partnership between us. If she sees that we are working with you, it will soften her stance. You can help us merge our worlds. All you have to do is be the bridge, Mason. Help us connect with her firm, and everything else falls into place. It was the ultimate trap wrapped in the shiny paper of familial love and corporate success. They were trying to trick him into becoming a Trojan horse. They needed a direct line to the multi-billion-dollar private equity firm of Savannah, and they thought a naive 18-year-old boy would gladly hand them the keys to the castle for a vintage watch and a fake board seat. Mason nodded slowly. I want to help you, he said, his voice quiet and earnest. I really do. I have always wanted to know my family. Patricia let out a soft cry of joy, reaching out to hug him again. I knew you had a good heart, she whispered. Jason clapped his hands together, his face breaking into a triumphant grin. We booked a private dining room at a very exclusive steakhouse in downtown Dallas for this Saturday evening. We can have a proper family dinner and sign the preliminary paperwork for your board seat. But Mason, it is absolutely crucial that you keep this between us for now. You cannot tell Savannah about the dinner or the board seat. She will overreact and try to sabotage it. I can do that, Mason said, offering them a trusting smile. I will not say a single word to my mom. I will definitely see you on Saturday. Patricia sobbed in relief, pressing her cheek against his chest. We knew you would understand, she whispered. We cannot wait to have our family whole again. Thomas delivered a respectful handshake. Welcome to the table, son, he said. We are incredibly proud of the man you have become. You will do great things for Texas Star Logistics. Jason winked. Keep this strictly between us. Savannah will do everything to shut this down. Just show up at the steakhouse on Saturday evening in a nice suit. We will handle the rest. Mason nodded earnestly, slipping the box into his backpack. I will be there, he promised, maintaining his eager expression. Mason watched them turn away. They walked toward the parking lot with undeniable swagger, exchanging triumphant glances. Patricia dabbed her eyes, smiling. Jason clapped his father on the back like a man who just closed a lucrative deal. They believed they successfully manipulated a lonely teenager into handing them the keys to a multi-billion-dollar firm. Mason waited until they disappeared. His innocent smile vanished. The hesitant college freshman evaporated, replaced by the sharp, calculating focus of a young man raised by a ruthless financial executive. He walked briskly down a narrow walkway behind the science building, emptying into a restricted access service alley. Idling silently in the dark shadows was a sleek black sport utility vehicle with heavily tinted windows. Mason climbed into the rear passenger seat and shut the heavy door with a solid thud. I was sitting in the back holding a tablet displaying market fluctuations. I set it aside as my son settled in. Without a word, Mason unzipped his backpack. He pulled out the velvet jewelry box and casually tossed it onto the empty leather seat between us. It tumbled open, revealing the gleaming vintage gold watch. I looked at the watch with a cold smile. I recognized it immediately. It was the watch my father wore to country club dinners when I was a child. He must be desperate. The bait is set, Mom, Mason said, dropping his naive pitch. They bought the entire performance. They think I am completely mesmerized by the idea of a secret family trust. I leaned back, studying his face. Walk me through exactly what they said. Do not skip a detail. Mason recounted the conversation with precision. He detailed how Patricia weaponized her tears and how Thomas played the strong patriarch. Then he dissected Jason's pitch. Jason did the heavy lifting, Mason explained. He tried to convince me you cut me off from a massive family trust out of spite. He claimed millions were waiting for me. Then he offered me a seat on the board of directors for Texas Star Logistics, pitching it as a mentoring opportunity to learn the ropes of running an enterprise. A board seat, I repeated. You do not offer an 18-year-old a board seat out of pure kindness. A board seat carries actual legal weight and direct fiduciary responsibility. Mason nodded. That is not even the best part. Jason explicitly told me they need a bridge between their family company and your firm. He told me if I take the board seat, I can facilitate a strategic partnership between the two businesses. They invited me to a private dinner at a steakhouse in Dallas this Saturday. They want me to sign the paperwork right there at the table. He was incredibly insistent that I keep the entire thing a secret from you. The revelation hit me with chilling clarity. The fragmented pieces of their desperate plans snapped together to form a perfectly cohesive, highly illegal picture. I looked at the gold watch, then at my son. We shared a cold, calculating look of mutual understanding. The sheer audacity of my family was almost impressive in its toxicity. They do not want a bridge, Mason, I said, my voice dangerously calm. They want a human shield. What kind of paperwork do you think they are going to put in front of me on Saturday? Mason asked, analyzing the legal implications. I leaned forward. Last night, my forensic accounting team tore Texas Star Logistics apart. The company is completely insolvent. Jason embezzled millions into offshore accounts and covered the operational deficits by taking out $25 million in commercial loans. My parents personally guaranteed those loans by putting up their mansion and estate as collateral. The bank is preparing to foreclose on everything that they own. Mason processed the numbers instantly. So they are drowning in $25 million of toxic debt and want me to sign corporate documents making me a member of their board. Not just a member of the board, I corrected him. They are going to bury a guarantor clause inside that paperwork. They know you are my only child. They know if you sign a legal document associating yourself with their corporate entity, they can attempt to leverage your connection to my private equity firm. They are trying to trick you into signing a document that legally binds you, and by extension, my assets to their failing logistics company. They want to use you to force my firm to absorb their $25 million debt. Mason let out a humorless laugh. They really think I am that stupid. They think I am going to sign a corporate contract at a steakhouse without having a lawyer review it just because my uncle gave me a gold watch. They think you are a teenager, desperate for a father figure and a sense of belonging, I told him. They are projecting their own vanity onto you. They believe because they can be bought with status and shiny objects, you can be bought the exact same way. They have no idea who raised you. Mason snapped the velvet box shut, hiding the gold watch. So what is the play? Do I ghost them on Saturday? Do we send the legal team to the restaurant instead? I shook my head slowly, a deep sense of anticipation settling into my chest. My family spent my entire life trying to humiliate me. They threw me onto the street, smeared my name in the press, and now they were trying to financially ruin my son. I was not going to send lawyers to handle this. I was going to handle it myself. No, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal tone. You are going to go to that dinner, Mason. You will put on your best suit and walk into that private dining room, looking exactly like the naive, eager young man they expect to see. You will let them pour the expensive wine and let Jason give his big, charismatic speech about family legacy. Mason smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that mirrored my own. And when he slides the contract across the table, I replied, you will show them exactly what a real corporate takeover looks like. We have 48 hours until Saturday night. That is more than enough time to buy a sinking ship. I picked up my phone and opened my encrypted communication application. I had a whole lot of calls to make and a massive amount of distressed debt to purchase. My parents wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial leverage. They were about to learn that in the world of private equity, I never sit down at a table unless I already own the room. The drive back to my corporate headquarters took less than 20 minutes, but we used every single second of that commute to formulate our exact strategy. I made 3 phone calls instructing my lead corporate attorney to assemble the acquisition team. By the time my driver pulled into the underground parking garage, the machinery of my firm was roaring to life. We walked through the private executive entrance, bypassing the busy lobby entirely. Mason matched my pace perfectly. He carried himself with the cold, focused energy of a junior executive who fully understood the gravity of the transaction we were executing. We pushed through the glass doors of the primary boardroom where my legal team was already gathered. I took my seat at the head of the table, and Mason sat directly to my right. We have a highly sensitive accelerated acquisition to complete, I told them, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the room. We need to purchase a distressed commercial debt portfolio currently held by Texas Regional Bank. The total outstanding balance is $25 million. It belongs to Texas Star Logistics. That is correct, I continued. They have defaulted on their operational loans, and the bank has initiated preliminary foreclosure proceedings against my parents' personal estate. The bank knows this debt is toxic. They know the company is insolvent. We are going to offer them a way out. But my name cannot be anywhere near this transaction. If my family or the bank catches wind that I am the buyer, they will try to leverage the connection. I turned to Mason. I want to establish a new holding corporation completely insulated by strict privacy laws. I want Mason listed as the sole proprietor, the primary shareholder, and the chief executive officer. By the time we leave this building tonight, my son will have absolute legal authority over every asset and liability tied to Texas Star Logistics. The legal team moved with breathtaking speed. Over the next 6 hours, they drafted the articles of incorporation, utilizing the industry pathways available to firms of our magnitude. We established a holding company named Vanguard Capital Acquisitions, routing the ownership structure through a series of anonymous blind trusts that legally shielded the identity of the true owner while granting Mason total operational control. I watched my 18-year-old son sign his name across dozens of highly complex legal documents without a single tremor in his hand. He absorbed the harsh reality of what he was doing. He was legally becoming the absolute architect of his grandparents' financial ruin. By Thursday morning, Vanguard Capital Acquisitions was a fully legitimate, heavily capitalized corporate entity ready to conduct business. The second phase of our operation was entirely in my hands. I sat at my desk looking at the direct phone number for the Senior Vice President of Distressed Assets at Texas Regional Bank. I picked up my secure line and dialed the number. The executive answered on the third ring. When I introduced myself as the chief executive officer of my private equity firm, his demeanor instantly shifted to one of intense respect. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I represented an anonymous private buyer looking to acquire distressed regional logistics portfolios, and I specifically mentioned the $25 million debt held by Texas Star Logistics. The banker let out a heavy sigh. That specific portfolio is currently categorized as highly distressed Savannah. The current management has mismanaged their operational capital, and the guarantors are tapped out. We are moving toward asset seizure, but liquidating their personal real estate is going to be a messy, drawn-out process. We are expecting a significant loss on this one. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, staring out at the Austin skyline. What if I told you my client is willing to take that entire headache off your desk by the end of the business day today? I asked smoothly. The silence on the other end of the line was palpable. What kind of offer is your client putting on the table? I offered them exactly what the debt was actually worth. I proposed a cash purchase of the entire debt portfolio for exactly $4 million payable via immediate wire transfer. The bank would take a substantial loss, but they would get $4 million of clean liquid cash, instantly sparing them years of messy foreclosure litigation. The negotiation lasted less than 40 minutes. The banker tried to push for $6 million, citing the value of the residential collateral, but I ruthlessly dismantled his entire argument. I pointed out the rapidly cooling housing market and the very high legal costs of evicting stubborn homeowners. I held firm at $4 million. Desperate to clean up his balance sheet, the executive finally agreed. The speed of modern corporate finance is truly terrifying when you have the right leverage. By Friday afternoon, Exactly 24 hours before Mason was scheduled to sit down at the steakhouse with his uncle and grandparents, the final acquisition documents arrived via secure courier. I sat alone at the large conference table in my office, meticulously reviewing the thick stack of legal contracts. Every single commercial loan, every line of credit, and every personal guarantee tied to Texas Star Logistics had been officially reassigned to Vanguard Capital Acquisitions. Mason walked into my office just as I was signing the final witness line. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit, breaking in the clothes he would wear to the dinner the next night. He walked over to the table and looked down at the documents. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice steady. I handed him the very thick sealed manila folder. "You are holding the net worth of Thomas, Patricia, and Jason," I told him. "As of exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon, the bank no longer owns their debt. You do. You own the mortgage on the mansion they refuse to let me sleep in. You own the logistics company Jason used to fund his lifestyle. You own the cars they drive and the chairs they sit on. If they miss a single payment, you have absolute legal authority to liquidate their existence." Mason opened the folder, his eyes carefully scanning the official bank transfers and the assignment of debt notices. A slow, dark smile spread across his face. "For 18 years they thought they had won," Mason said softly, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "They thought they could throw you away, erase me from their history, and just go on living their perfect wealthy lives without facing any consequences. And now they are going to walk into a restaurant tomorrow night, thinking they can use me to save themselves." I stepped closer to my son, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "They are going to slide a legal contract across that table, Mason. They are going to smile and tell you that blood is always thicker than water. They are going to offer you a fake board seat to stroke your ego, hoping you are too young to realize you are signing your life away to cover their crimes." Mason looked at me, his expression hardening into pure resolve. "I know exactly what I'm going to do, Mom. I am just going to let them put their cards on the table. And then I am truly going to show them that I own the casino." 15 miles away from my corporate headquarters, oblivious to the financial guillotine suspended directly over their heads, my family was busy celebrating a victory they had not actually won. The setting for their premature triumph was the dining terrace of the most exclusive country club in the Dallas suburbs. Thomas, Patricia, and Jason sat at their usual corner table under a large canvas umbrella. They looked like a wealthy dynasty. My father wore a tailored linen jacket, projecting the relaxed confidence of a successful patriarch. My mother was dressed in pastel silk, her jewelry catching the late afternoon sunlight. Jason sat across from them, leaning back with the careless posture of a man who believed he had outsmarted the entire financial sector. They were putting on a public performance projecting absolute financial security to the other club members while secretly carrying $25 million in toxic debt. A waiter approached their table carrying a silver bucket packed with crushed ice and a bottle of vintage champagne that cost more than most people paid for a year of rent. Jason waved the waiter off, insisting on pouring the drinks himself. He handed a glass to our mother and another to our father before raising his own. "To family," Jason said, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. "And to the incredible power of a cheap vintage watch and a few fake tears." Patricia let out a sharp laugh, taking a long sip of her champagne. She smoothed the front of her silk blouse, leaning closer to the center of the table. "I honestly cannot believe how easy that was," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I thought we would have to work on the boy for weeks. But the moment I started crying, he completely melted. He looked at me like a lost puppy." Thomas nodded, taking a slow sip from his glass. He was desperate for a family connection. Savannah might have taught him how to read a balance sheet, but she clearly isolated him from normal human affection. She built a massive financial fortress, but she left the front gate wide open by raising a lonely, gullible kid. Jason chuckled, resting his elbows on the wrought iron table. "That is the irony of it all. She thinks she is so much smarter than us because she runs a private equity firm in Austin. She thinks she is untouchable, but she completely forgot that her son is just an 18-year-old boy with a massive ego." I offered him a fake seat on a corporate board and his eyes practically lit up like a slot machine. He is so eager to play the big shot executive that he is not even going to read the fine print. The mention of the fine print brought a serious calculating energy to the table. Thomas set his champagne flute down, leaning forward and lowering his voice so the neighboring tables could not hear their conversation. Do you have the paperwork finalized for tomorrow night? We cannot afford a single mistake with the bank hovering over our estate. If this fails, the foreclosure goes through on Monday morning. Jason reached down and pulled a sleek leather portfolio from his briefcase resting on the terrace floor. He placed it on the table and opened it, revealing a thick stack of densely typed legal contracts. I had the corporate lawyers draft this yesterday, Jason explained, tapping the top page with his index finger. On the surface, it looks like a standard integration agreement for a junior board member. It grants him an honorary title, a small stipend, and zero actual voting power over the logistics company. It looks exactly like the kind of mentoring contract you would give to a college freshman. Patricia looked at the stack of papers, a nervous energy flickering in her eyes. And the guarantor clause. Jason flipped to the middle of the stack, pointing to a paragraph buried deep within a dense wall of corporate liability jargon. It is right here on page 42, buried under 3 layers of standard indemnification text. The clause explicitly states that by accepting the board seat, the signatory agrees to become a joint guarantor of the current outstanding commercial debt held by Texas Star Logistics. Thomas read the paragraph carefully, a slow, predatory smile forming on his weathered face. And because he is Savannah's legal dependent, and because she has heavily integrated her personal wealth with her corporate holding structures, the bank can use his signature as a crowbar. Exactly, Jason confirmed, closing the portfolio with a solid thud. When Mason signs this contract at the steakhouse tomorrow night, he becomes legally responsible for our toxic debt. The bank will immediately pivot away from foreclosing on your mansion and go straight after the deepest pockets available. They will go after Savannah's private equity firm. She will have absolutely no choice. She will have to pay off the entire $25 million loan to save her precious son from total financial ruin before his career even begins. Patricia let out a long, shaky breath, reaching out to grasp her husband's hand across the table. So it is really going to work. We are going to save the house. We are going to save the business. We are not going to federal prison. The sheer relief in her voice was sickening. For months, she had been terrified of losing her country club status, of facing her wealthy friends after a very public bankruptcy. The thought of trading her designer dresses for a prison uniform had kept her awake every single night. Now she felt completely untouchable again. We are going to be completely clear by Monday, Thomas assured her, his voice brimming with arrogant certainty. Savannah thought she could walk away from us. She thought she could let us drown while she sat in her ivory tower. But she is going to pay for everything. She is going to cover Jason's operational deficits. She is going to clear our mortgage, and she is going to do it quietly, to keep her son out of a federal courtroom. Jason raised his champagne glass one more time, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. To Savannah, he mocked softly. The daughter who thought she was too good for this family, about to fund our lifestyle for the rest of our lives. They clinked their crystal glasses together, the delicate sound ringing out over the country club terrace. They spent the next hour laughing about my supposed stupidity, planning upcoming vacations and discussing renovations they wanted to make to the mansion once my money cleared their debts. Jason even joked about buying a new coastal vacation home using the leftover settlement money they planned to extort from me. They were completely consumed by their own vanity, blinded by a lifetime of never facing real consequences for their actions. They thought they were the architects of a brilliant, flawless corporate trap. They thought they had cornered a naive 18-year-old boy and outsmarted a multi-billion-dollar firm. They had no idea that while they were sipping champagne and celebrating their imaginary victory, I had already purchased the ground beneath their feet. They had no idea that the bank they were so terrified of no longer owned their debt. They had no idea that my son was walking into that steakhouse tomorrow night, not as their victim, but as their absolute financial executioner. Saturday night arrived with the thick, humid heat typical of a Texas autumn. In the heart of downtown Dallas, inside one of the most exclusive and formidably expensive steakhouses in the city, My parents and my brother sat waiting in a private dining room. The space was an enclave of pure insulated luxury. Heavy mahogany paneled walls absorbed the sounds of the bustling main dining floor, creating a quiet, intimate atmosphere reserved for high-stakes corporate deal-making. A massive chandelier cast a warm golden glow over a round table set with pristine white linen polished silver and sparkling crystal glasses. Thomas, Patricia, and Jason had arrived nearly an hour early to secure the room and establish their territory. They sat together on one side of the large table, projecting the image of a unified, massively successful dynasty. Thomas was swirling a generous pour of a highly rated Cabernet Sauvignon in his glass, his posture relaxed and expansive. Patricia was adjusting the clasp of her diamond bracelet, her eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors every few minutes. Jason sat back in his deep leather chair, his suit jacket unbuttoned, tapping a steady, confident rhythm on the armrest. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. In their minds, they were mere minutes away from executing the greatest financial rescue operation of their lives. They believed their $25 million nightmare was about to evaporate with a single stroke of a pen. Precisely at 8 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. Mason stepped into the room and the dynamic instantly shifted. My son was wearing a charcoal gray, flawlessly tailored suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His tie was a subtle dark silk, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He looked exactly like the wealthy, ambitious young heir they wanted him to be. But beneath the expensive fabric, Mason was operating with the cold, calculated precision of a seasoned undercover operative. He paused just inside the doorway, allowing a small, perfectly calibrated expression of nervous hesitation to cross his face. Patricia was the first to break the silence. She let out a soft gasp of manufactured delight and stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the hardwood floor. She rushed across the room, wrapping her arms around Mason in a suffocating embrace, acting as if he were a soldier returning from a long, arduous war. Mason endured the hug with a stiff, polite smile, gently patting her back before she finally released him. Thomas stood up next, walking over to deliver a firm, aggressive handshake designed to establish patriarchal dominance. He pulled Mason in close, gripping his shoulder tight, and told him how proud he was to see his grandson looking like a true man of business. Jason remained seated, but offered a wide, charismatic grin, gesturing to the empty chair directly across the table from him. They ushered Mason to his seat, immediately treating him like an honored guest who had finally come home. The waiter arrived discreetly, and Jason took absolute control of the interaction. He ordered a massive, dry-aged ribeye for Mason, without even asking him what he wanted, playing the role of the generous, wealthy uncle, showing the young college student how the elite class operated. He ordered another bottle of the expensive Cabernet, ignoring the fact that Mason was 18, treating it as a conspiratorial bonding moment between the men of the family. Mason played his part flawlessly. He accepted the gestures with wide, appreciative eyes, projecting the image of a teenager, completely dazzled by the wealth and attention being showered upon him. As the first courses arrived, the conversation was carefully steered to butter Mason up. Patricia leaned across the table, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow as she talked about how empty the family holidays had been without him. She spun elaborate fictional tales about the times they had supposedly tried to reach out to him, casually dropping entirely fabricated stories about how my stubbornness had broken their hearts. Thomas chimed in, pivoting the conversation toward the legendary history of Texas Star Logistics. He painted a grand, sweeping picture of a massive, thriving corporate empire. He talked about profit margins, expanding fleets, and dominating the regional supply chain, completely omitting the fact that the company was a hollow shell, drowning in toxic debt. Jason acted as the bridge between the emotional manipulation and the corporate pitch. He leaned forward, cutting into his steak, and told Mason how much raw potential he saw in him. He praised Mason for choosing to study finance, telling him that a degree from a top-tier university, combined with the real-world experience of a corporate board seat, would make him an unstoppable force in the business world. Jason spoke with such conviction, utilizing all the charm he usually reserved for swindling investors, weaving a beautiful illusion of a limitless future. Mason ate it up. He asked naive, eager questions about supply chain logistics and corporate management structures. He fed their massive egos, making them feel like the brilliant business titans they desperately wanted to be. They had absolutely no idea that the young man nodding enthusiastically at their stories had spent the previous 48 hours executing a ruthless, complex acquisition of their entire financial existence. As the waiter cleared the empty dessert plates and poured the last of the wine, the atmosphere in the room underwent a subtle but distinct shift. The casual, familial warmth evaporated, replaced by a focused, predatory business energy. Jason wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, tossed it onto the table, and exchanged a quick, meaningful glance with Thomas. Patricia sat up straighter, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. The trap was ready to be sprung. Jason reached down to the floor beside his chair and lifted his sleek leather portfolio. He placed it squarely in the center of the table. The soft thud of the leather hitting the wood echoed loudly in the quiet room. He unzipped the portfolio and pulled out a thick, dense stack of legal documents. He squared the edges of the paper meticulously before sliding the entire stack across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of Mason. "This is it, buddy," Jason said, his voice dropping to a serious, confidential register. "This is the integration agreement we talked about. This is your official welcome to the board of directors for Texas Star Logistics." Thomas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, fixing Mason with a heavy, expectant stare. "This document makes you an official part of the family legacy, Mason. It means you are no longer just an outsider looking in. It means you have a voice, a title, and a direct line to the generational wealth we have spent our entire lives building." Mason looked down at the thick stack of papers. The cover page was filled with standard corporate boilerplate language designed to look incredibly official and incredibly boring. He knew exactly what was buried inside. He knew that somewhere around page 42, there was a dense paragraph of indemnification text that would legally transform him into a joint guarantor of $25 million in commercial debt. He knew that the moment he put his signature on the final page, Jason and Thomas intended to march straight to their bank and use that signature to leverage my private equity firm into bailing out their sinking ship. Jason reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, expensive fountain pen. He uncapped it with a smooth, practiced motion and placed it gently on top of the signature page of the contract. He looked at Mason, his eyes gleaming with the manic, desperate anticipation of a gambler pushing his last pile of chips to the center of the table. "Signing. This integrates your future directly into the family trust," Jason said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "We are giving you a massive head start on life. You just put your name on that dotted line, and I personally guarantee that you will be a millionaire by the time you graduate college." Patricia held her breath, her eyes fixed on the fountain pen resting on the table. Thomas remained perfectly still, watching Mason, like a hawk watching its prey. The silence in the private dining room was absolute, thick with the crushing weight of their desperation. Mason looked up from the contract. He looked at his grandmother, trembling with anticipation. He looked at his grandfather, projecting false strength. He looked at his uncle, offering a predatory smile. Then, moving with slow, deliberate precision, Mason reached out and picked up the heavy fountain pen. He twirled it between his fingers for a fraction of a second, feeling the cool metal against his skin. He lowered his gaze back to the dense legal contract sitting in front of him. He let the silence stretch out just a moment longer, letting their hopeful anticipation reach its absolute peak. And then Mason smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. It was cold and entirely devoid of warmth. The three adults did not register the shift. Patricia was still beaming with manufactured affection. Thomas was reaching for his wineglass to propose a toast. Jason nodded encouragingly, waiting for the ink to hit the paper. Instead of signing his name, Mason let the heavy fountain pen slip from his fingers. It hit the mahogany table with a sharp clatter that echoed in the dining room. The pen rolled across the wood and stopped against Jason's glass. The silence was immediate. Patricia blinked, her bright smile faltering slightly as confusion replaced her joy. Thomas paused with his hand hovering over his glass, frowning heavily. Jason let out a nervous chuckle, leaning forward. "Hey, no pressure, buddy," Jason said, attempting to maintain his charismatic cadence. If you need a minute to read the clauses, that is fine. We want you completely comfortable. Mason ignored the contract. He lifted his own black leather portfolio, placing it squarely on top of the dense stack of legal documents Jason prepared. The desperate trap was now buried under a single folder. I appreciate the offer for the honorary board seat, Uncle Jason, Mason said. His voice changed completely. The hesitant tone of a naive college freshman vanished. In its place was the smooth, calculating, authoritative cadence of a seasoned financial executive. Mason looked directly into his uncle's eyes, projecting absolute dominance. But I am going to decline the position, Mason continued. You promised that if I signed that paper, I would be a millionaire by graduation. The problem is, I am already a millionaire. Patricia let out a confused laugh, looking around the table as if waiting for someone to explain the joke. Mason, sweetheart, what are you talking about? She asked, her voice tight with panic. Thomas slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. What kind of game is this? He demanded, flushing angry red. We are offering you the family empire and you are playing games. Savannah poisoned you against your own blood. Mason did not flinch or react to the sudden burst of anger. He simply kept his eyes locked on the three of them, perfectly composed. My mother did not poison me, Mason said. She taught me how to read a balance sheet and how to recognize a sinking ship. There is no family empire. There is only a regional logistics company bleeding operational capital for 4 years, while its managing director funnels the remaining cash into offshore accounts in Delaware. The color drained from Jason's face. The charismatic uncle evaporated, replaced by a terrified man who had just been caught committing federal corporate fraud. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords seized up. He stared at Mason in horror. Thomas whipped his head around to look at Jason, reading the undeniable guilt plastered across his son's pale features. What is he talking about? Thomas demanded, his voice cracking with desperate fear. Fear. Jason, what the hell is he talking about? Jason could not answer. He was paralyzed, staring at the black folder as if it were a live explosive device. Patricia grabbed her husband's arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of his jacket. This is a lie, she stammered, her breathing shallow and erratic. Savannah made all of this up to ruin us. Our company is fine. Your company is entirely insolvent, Mason corrected her. You have defaulted on your fleet leases. You are months behind on your vendor payouts. And more importantly, you are drowning in $25 million of highly toxic commercial debt. Debt that you, Thomas and Patricia, personally guaranteed by leveraging your entire estate, your pensions, and your remaining stock portfolios. Thomas slumped back in his heavy leather chair. The fight completely left his body, replaced by a hollow, crushing realization. The secret they had guarded with their lives, the financial ruin they tried to bury beneath country club dinners and expensive champagne, was suddenly lying bare in the middle of the steakhouse. You were going to use me, Mason continued, tapping the top of his black folder. You invited me here to trick me into signing a guarantor clause hidden in your fake agreement. You wanted to legally bind me to your $25 million failure, knowing my mother would be forced to liquidate her private equity assets to bail you out. You wanted to use your own grandson as a shield against the bank. Jason finally found his voice, a desperate whisper. The bank is going to foreclose on Monday morning, he said, his eyes darting frantically around the room. We had no other choice. If you do not sign that paper, we lose the mansion. We lose everything. You have to help us, Mason. Mason placed his hand on the sleek black folder. He slowly pushed it across the polished mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of his grandfather. You do not have to worry about the bank foreclosing on Monday morning, Mason said smoothly. The bank is not going to call you ever again. In fact, if you call your senior vice president of distressed assets at Texas Regional Bank right now, his secretary will inform you that your portfolio is no longer their problem. Thomas stared at the black folder. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out and flipped it open. Inside was a stack of fully executed commercial acquisition contracts. The top page was a formal notice of debt reassignment. What exactly is this? Thomas asked, his voice trembling so badly the words barely formed. Mason leaned back in his chair. He looked at the three people who had spent their entire lives destroying others for their own vanity. That is a formal notice of acquisition, Mason explained, projecting his voice clearly across the room. As of 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, Texas Regional Bank officially sold the entirety of your outstanding commercial debt portfolio. They bundled your defaulted loans, unpaid credit lines, and personal guarantees into a single package and sold it to a private holding company called Vanguard Capital Acquisitions. Patricia let out a small whimper. Vanguard Capital, she repeated, failing to grasp the corporate reality closing in around her. What does that mean? Who are they? Thomas began flipping frantically through the pages of the contract, his eyes scanning the dense legal text for a lifeline that did not exist. He reached the final signature page, tracing the authorized buyer information with a trembling finger. He stopped. His breathing halted completely. He looked up from the paper, his eyes locking onto Mason with an expression of pure terror. Mason offered them one final, absolutely lethal smile. "It means I own Vanguard Capital Acquisitions," Mason said softly. "It means I am the sole proprietor of the private equity holding company that just purchased your $25 million debt for pennies on the dollar. The bank does not own your business anymore. I do. The bank does not hold the mortgage on your mansion. I do. You do not owe the bank a single dime, Thomas. You owe me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an entire arrogant dynasty crumbling into dust in the middle of the room. Mason owned their luxury cars, failing business and mansion. He owned their entire existence, doing it all before finishing his first semester. The doors of the private dining room were pushed wide by the uncompromising hands of my lead corporate attorney, David. The thick wood hit the rubber doorstops with a heavy thud that shattered the tense silence. I walked in right behind him, my heels clicking a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression devoid of emotion. I did not look like a daughter coming to a family dinner. I looked like a financial executioner arriving to collect a debt. The absolute horror that washed over my parents' faces was something I will remember forever. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her throat. The manufactured tears she had been using to manipulate my son dried up, instantly replaced by terrified eyes. Jason froze. His confident uncle routine evaporated into thin air. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the color draining from his face until he looked physically ill. Thomas, who had spent the last hour projecting the aura of a powerful patriarch, shrank into his leather chair. They had spent the entire evening believing they were reeling in a naive college freshman. They thought they had successfully manipulated Mason into saving their sinking logistics empire. Now the crushing reality of their situation finally solidified. They had not trapped my son. They had willingly walked directly into a financial slaughterhouse. Mason did not look surprised. He offered me a sharp nod and calmly slid his chair back, making room for me at the head of the mahogany table. I took the seat, smoothing my jacket. David remained standing near the closed doors, a silent, imposing guardian ensuring no one left the room. For a long, suffocating moment, nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft clinking of silverware from the main restaurant outside and the shallow breathing of my mother. I sat perfectly still, letting the terrifying silence stretch out. I wanted them to feel the absolute weight of their failure. I wanted them to realize that the power dynamic they had relied on for my entire life was permanently broken. Thomas was the first to snap. The realization that he had been outplayed by the daughter he discarded 18 years ago was too much for his fragile ego to process. He slammed his hands flat against the table, rattling the crystal wine glasses, and pushed himself up to a standing position. His face turned a mottled shade of purple. "What the hell is this?" Thomas roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at me, trying to summon the terrifying authority he used to wield over our household. "You think you can just barge into a private dinner? You have no right to be here. I am calling the police. I will have you arrested for harassment and trespassing." He turned his furious glare toward Mason. "And you ungrateful brat. We offered you a place in this family and you set us up. You are just as bitter and toxic as your mother." Mason did not even blink. He leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his water, looking at his grandfather with absolute indifference. The utter lack of fear in my son infuriated Thomas even more. He reached for his phone, his hands trembling with rage, muttering threats about calling his lawyers, about destroying my firm in the press, and making me pay for humiliating him. I did not raise my voice or stand up to match his aggressive posture. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. My movements were slow, smooth, and unbothered by his screaming. I pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. I held it between my thumb and index finger for a fraction of a second, letting the overhead chandelier light catch the metallic surface. Then, with a careless flick of my wrist, I tossed the flash drive across the polished wood. It slid perfectly down the center of the table and dropped onto Thomas's pristine porcelain dinner plate with a sharp clink. The sound was small, but it cut through his enraged shouting like a gunshot. Thomas stopped mid-sentence. He looked down at the silver drive resting against his expensive dry-aged steak. He looked back up at me, the furious red color in his face giving way to a sickening gray. He slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair, the fight suddenly draining out of his body. He knew I would not hand him a physical object unless it contained something catastrophic. I rested my hands on the table, folding my fingers together. The analytical tone I used in my most ruthless board meetings filled the room. "Go ahead and call the police, Thomas," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "If you would like, David can dial the FBI field office for you. I am sure they would be highly interested in reviewing the contents of that drive." Jason let out a shaky breath. "What is on it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I shifted my gaze to my older brother. The golden child who had never faced a single consequence in his life was currently sweating through his tailored suit. "That drive contains the exact unredacted forensic paper trail of your offshore embezzlement." Jason, I explained, clinically breaking down his crimes with the precision of a surgeon. "It contains the routing numbers, the bank statements, and the digital signatures connecting Texas Star Logistics to 6 ghost consulting firms registered to a single post office box in Delaware." Patricia let out a muffled sob, burying her face in her hands. She knew exactly what those words meant. She knew the lifestyle she cherished was built on stolen money. "It details exactly how you systematically drained the operational capital of your own family business." I continued, refusing to let Jason look away. "It tracks every fraudulent invoice you approved and follows the money trail directly from those shell companies into hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands. You stole millions of dollars from your own company while defaulting on your vendors and fleet leases." Jason opened his mouth desperately, trying to find a lie that could save him. "It was a misunderstanding," he stammered, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. "It was aggressive tax structuring. Everyone does it. I was trying to protect the corporate assets." "You were washing stolen money," I corrected him, my voice slicing through his pathetic excuse. "And you did a terrible job of hiding it. But the embezzlement is not even the most interesting part of that flash drive. The truly fascinating data is the timeline of the commercial loans." I turned my attention back to my father. Thomas was staring at the small silver flash drive as if it were a venomous snake. "You see, Thomas," I said softly, allowing a hint of cold satisfaction to enter my tone. "You and Patricia personally guaranteed $25 million in commercial debt to keep the logistics company afloat. You leveraged your mansion, your pensions, and your stock portfolios. But you secured those loans while Jason was actively defrauding the company. You signed federal financial documents claiming the business was solvent, while your son was bleeding it dry to fund his luxury lifestyle." I slowly leaned forward, making sure they felt the absolute crushing weight of their reality. "In the eyes of the federal government, Jason committed wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion," I stated, laying out the legal guillotine. "But because you signed those commercial guarantees, Thomas, you and Patricia are legally classified as co-conspirators in a massive scheme to defraud a regional bank. That is not a civil misunderstanding. That is a federal crime with mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. If I hand that silver drive over to the authorities, Jason will serve a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. And the two of you will lose your pensions, your home, and your freedom, spending the rest of your lives in federal prison forever." The silence following my calm words was completely absolute. Patricia let out a ragged gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she comprehended the threat. She looked at my father, her eyes begging him to magically fix the situation to find some loophole. But Thomas had nothing left. He sat slumped in his leather chair, his shoulders sagging, looking older and frailer than I had ever seen him. The arrogant patriarch who had tried to intimidate my son just moments ago was entirely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man staring at the flash drive resting on his dinner plate. Jason tried to speak, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Savannah, you cannot do this," he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I am your brother. We grew up together. You cannot send me to a federal penitentiary. I will pay you back. I will find a way to restructure the debt. Just give me some time to fix the deficits. I will make you a majority shareholder." I looked at him with profound disgust. "I already own the company, Jason," I reminded him, my tone flat. "I own the debt, I own the assets, and I own your future. You have absolutely nothing left to offer me. There is no negotiation happening at this table tonight. There is only a choice." I gave a slight nod to David. My lead corporate attorney stepped forward, moving with the quiet, efficient grace of a predator. He unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents. He walked around the table and placed 3 separate packets of paper directly in front of Thomas, Patricia, and Jason. He set a pen on top of each stack, then stepped back into the shadows near the door, folding his arms across his chest. "What you are looking at is your only way out of this room without handcuffs," I stated, gesturing to the paperwork. "You have 2 options tonight. Option 1 is that I pick up that flash drive, walk out of this restaurant, and hand it directly to the federal authorities. The forensic accounting is airtight. The offshore wire transfers are documented. The loan guarantees are verified. You will be indicted by Tuesday morning. Option 2 is that you pick up those pens and sign every single page of the documents David placed in front of you. If you choose option 2, I will bury the forensic data. I will absorb the toxic debt through my private equity firm, and I will dissolve the logistics company quietly. You will avoid a federal courtroom, but the price of your freedom is absolute surrender." Thomas stared down at the crisp white paper. "What are the terms?" he asked, his voice completely defeated. First, I explained, leaning back in my chair. "You will immediately surrender the remaining 10% of your voting shares in the family trust and the logistics company. Those shares will be transferred directly to Mason. As of tonight, you have 0 equity, 0 voting rights, and 0 association with the corporate entity." Second, I continued, watching Patricia quietly sob. "You will vacate the Dallas estate by noon on Monday. I own the mortgage and I am foreclosing on the property. You will leave the cars, the jewelry purchased with company funds, and the antique furniture. You may take your personal clothing and whatever fits into the trunks of your personal vehicles. You will hand the keys to my private security team waiting at the front gate." Patricia let out a loud, heartbroken wail. "Savannah, please," she cried, reaching her trembling hands across the table toward me. "That is our home. We have lived there for 30 years. All of our friends are in that neighborhood. Where are we supposed to go? How are we supposed to live? You can live exactly how I lived. When you locked me out of the house in the middle of December," I told her, my voice turning to absolute ice. "You can figure it out. You can rent a small apartment. You can get minimum wage jobs. You can experience the exact same panic and desperation you forced onto a 17-year-old pregnant girl. You wanted me to disappear to protect your country club image. Now your image is gone, and you will learn how the real world operates." Third, Jason will issue a formal public retraction on the exact same local business podcast he used to smear my name. He will state clearly that he lied about me keeping Mason away, and he will publicly confess that his own business failures are the reason for his sudden departure from the corporate world. You will clear my name in the exact same venue you used to drag it through the mud. And finally, I said, looking at each of them in turn, "You will sign a legally binding non-contact agreement. You will never call me. You will never text Mason. You will never approach my corporate headquarters, and you will never speak of us to the media again. You will disappear from our lives forever. If you violate this agreement even once, I will release the financial dossier to the press and the authorities simultaneously." Thomas closed his eyes, a tear escaping and rolling down his weathered cheek. He looked at the paper, then at the flash drive resting on his plate. He raised a shaking hand, reaching for the pen. Dad, wait. Jason pleaded, grabbing his father's wrist. We cannot just sign everything over. We will be ruined. We will have absolutely nothing. We can fight this in court. Mason finally spoke. He pulled his cell phone from his suit pocket and placed it flat on the mahogany table. You do not have time to find a lawyer, Uncle Jason? Mason said, his tone razor-sharp and unyielding. My mother is not negotiating with you. She is giving you an ultimatum. You have exactly 60 seconds to pick up those pens and sign the documents. If those pages are not signed when the timer hits 0, I am dialing the federal authorities myself. Mason tapped the screen of his phone. A digital timer appeared, counting down from 60 seconds. The bright white numbers glowed harshly in the dim lighting of the private dining room. 59, 58, 57. The ticking numbers broke whatever resistance remained in my father. Thomas ripped his arm away from Jason's grasp. He snatched the black pen from the table, his hands shaking violently. He flipped to the signature page of the asset surrender agreement and hastily scribbled his name. We have no choice, Jason Thomas said, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. She owns everything. She has the proof. If we do not sign, we are going to die in a prison cell. Pick up the pen. Patricia let out an agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands for a moment before reaching out blindly for her own pen. She was crying so hard, her tears splashed onto the crisp legal paper, blurring the black ink as she signed her name. She surrendered her mansion, her social status, and her entire identity in a matter of seconds. The timer on Mason's phone continued to count down. 30 seconds, 29, 28. Jason stared at the paper in front of him. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and absolute terror. The golden boy who had never been told no was finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of entitlement and greed. 10 seconds. Mason announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room. 9, 8, 7. Jason let out a guttural sound of pure, absolute defeat. He finally grabbed the heavy black pen and slashed his signature across the bottom of his document, pressing down so incredibly hard that the tip of the pen nearly tore right through the thick white paper. He dropped the pen and shoved the signed packet toward the center of the table, burying his face in his hands. The heavy silence in the private dining room was broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of Jason gasping for air behind his hands. The 3 thick packets of legal documents now sat in the center of the polished mahogany table, fully executed. The ink was barely dry, but the transfer of power was absolute and irreversible. They had signed away the remaining fractions of their voting shares. They had signed away their massive estate. They had signed away their entire false reality. For a moment, nobody moved. I sat at the head of the table, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the arms of my chair. Mason reached forward with quiet clinical efficiency. He gathered the 3 signed packets, squared their edges together, and slipped them securely into his black leather portfolio. The soft sound of the zipper closing seemed to shatter the last remaining illusion of their control. It was the physical finality of that zipper that finally broke my mother. Patricia let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. It was not the theatrical manufactured wailing she had used at the charity gala. It was a raw, primal sound of genuine terror. Her knees buckled beneath the table. She slid off the edge of her heavy leather dining chair, her silk dress catching on the armrest as she collapsed onto the floor. She did not just kneel, she crumbled. "Savannah, please," she sobbed, her voice echoing off the dark wood paneling of the room. She crawled forward on the expensive carpet, reaching her shaking hands out toward the hem of my trousers. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot just take everything and leave us with nothing. We are your parents. I carried you. I raised you. Please, Savannah, look at me. Remember who we are. We are your family." I looked down at her. The woman who had spent my entire childhood criticizing my appearance, dismissing my intelligence, and treating my existence as an inconvenient footnote to Jason's athletic career was now begging at my feet. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no triumph, no residual sorrow, no spark of pity. There was only a cold, sterile void where a daughter's love should have been. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I looked directly into her terrified, tear-streaked eyes. "Do not ever invoke the title of mother to me." I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet whisper that carried effortlessly across the room. A mother does not watch her 17-year-old daughter beg for shelter and choose to draw the curtains. A mother does not pack her pregnant child's entire life into garbage bags and toss them onto a frozen lawn in the middle of a blizzard. Patricia choked on a sob, shaking her head frantically, as if she could erase the memory. We were scared. She wept, her hands clutching at the air. We did not know what to do. You were ruining your life. We wanted to teach you a lesson. You taught me a lesson. I agreed, my tone razor sharp. You taught me exactly what conditional love looks like. You taught me that my physical survival was worth less than your country club reputation. You taught me how it feels to sleep in the back seat of a freezing car, wrapping myself in dirty moving blankets, trying to keep my core temperature up so the baby inside me would not freeze to death. I spent months terrified that I would lose Mason because I could not afford prenatal vitamins or adequate food. I learned my lesson perfectly, Patricia. And now you are going to learn yours. The sheer lack of empathy in my voice finally registered in Jason's mind. The shock of his surrender was rapidly mutating into a blind, reckless panic. He looked at the black portfolio sitting in front of Mason, realizing that his entire multi-million-dollar lifestyle was locked inside it. The country club memberships, the luxury imported cars, the extravagant vacations. It was all gone. Jason snapped. With a sudden guttural roar of pure rage, he kicked his chair backwards so hard it crashed into the mahogany wall. He lunged across the wide dining table, his arms outstretched, his fingers hooked into claws as he aimed directly for Mason's throat. "You stole my company!" Jason screamed, his face contorted into a mask of violent fury. "Give me those papers back! I will kill you!" He never even made it halfway across the table. David, my lead corporate attorney, moved with terrifying speed. He stepped out of the shadows near the door, crossed the distance in two massive strides, and grabbed Jason by the back of his tailored suit collar. With one fluid, brutal, David ripped Jason backward off the table and slammed him violently against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of my brother, leaving him gasping and coughing as David pinned him in place with a forearm pressed firmly against his chest. I would strongly advise against physically assaulting a majority shareholder. David said, his voice completely calm and laced with a subtle, dangerous edge. Especially when you are currently facing $25 million in corporate fraud liabilities. Jason struggled weakly against the attorney's grip, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He looked at Thomas silently, begging his father to intervene to assert his patriarchal dominance and save him like he always had. But Thomas did not move. He was sitting completely frozen in his chair, his hands resting limply on his lap. He stared at the empty space on the table where the contracts had been. He looked like a man who had just witnessed his own funeral. The reality of his situation had entirely paralyzed him. "Let him go, David," I instructed smoothly, picking up my glass of water and taking a slow sip. David stepped back, releasing his hold. Jason stumbled forward, catching himself on the edge of the dining table. He was breathing heavily, his suit jacket wrinkled and pulled askew. The illusion of the polished, successful regional executive was completely shattered. He looked pathetic. "You need to understand the absolute finality of this moment," I told them, addressing the three broken figures in the room. "The documents you just signed are irrevocable. They have already been digitally logged by my legal team waiting outside this restaurant. The transfer of assets is legally binding and effective immediately. You no longer have a mansion. You no longer have a logistics company. You no longer have a legacy." I turned my gaze to Thomas, who finally lifted his head to meet my eyes. "You will vacate the Dallas estate by noon on Monday," I reminded him, making sure the deadline was permanently burned into his mind. "My private security team will be waiting at the front gates. You will leave the keys to the property, the keys to the company vehicles, and every piece of jewelry purchased with embezzled corporate funds. If there is a single item missing from the inventory manifest, or if you attempt to damage the property on your way out, I will consider it a breach of our agreement." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "Where are we supposed to go?" he whispered, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "That is the beauty of total financial ruin," Thomas, I replied with a cold, calculated smile. "It is no longer my problem. You can rent a cheap apartment." You can figure out how to navigate the public transportation system. You can learn how to live on the very bottom rung of the economic ladder, just like you forced me to do 18 years ago. Patricia was still weeping on the floor, her hands covering her face. Jason was leaning against the table, staring at the floor with blank, defeated eyes. The absolute destruction of their false reality was complete. And do not forget the public retraction, Mason added, speaking for the first time since the contracts were signed. He picked up his black portfolio and stood up from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket with perfect composure. You have an appointment booked with that exact same business podcast on Tuesday morning. You are going to sit in front of those microphones and you are going to tell the entire city that you lied about my mother. You are going to confess that your business failed because you are an incompetent fraud. Jason squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in misery. They will ruin me, he whispered. I will never get a job in this state again. You should have thought about your professional reputation before you embezzled millions of dollars and tried to extort my mother, Mason replied coldly. I stood up from the head of the table, my presence commanding the room one final time. I looked at the three of them, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure wash over me. The terrified teenager they had discarded was gone. In her place was a woman who had built an empire and protected her bloodline with absolute ruthlessness. If you violate the non-contact agreement, I warn them, delivering my final condition. If you ever attempt to call me, if you ever try to approach Mason, if you ever speak to the press after your retraction, I will hand that flash drive to the federal authorities without a second thought. You will disappear from our lives forever, or you will disappear into a federal penitentiary. The choice is yours. I did not offer any parting words of comfort. I simply nodded to David, who gathered the remaining portfolios. Mason stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked to my side. Together we walked out of the private dining room, leaving the heavy oak doors open behind us, stepping away from the past. The sounds of the bustling steakhouse rushed in, drowning out my mother's quiet weeping. As we stepped out into the warm Dallas night, the oppressive weight that had lingered in my chest for 18 years finally evaporated. I had not just protected my son and my empire. I had severed the last emotional chains tying me to the people who had tried to break me. The weekend passed in a blur of swift, ruthless corporate efficiency. My legal team filed the necessary documents to officially dissolve the toxic debt and assume complete control of the remaining viable assets. But the true consequences of their extortion attempt began to unfold on Tuesday morning, precisely as I had demanded. Jason sat in the exact same podcast studio where he had confidently smeared my name just days earlier. I watched the live stream from my office in Austin, with Mason sitting quietly on the sofa across the room watching justice unfold. My brother looked completely hollowed out. He wore a rumpled shirt, his shoulders slumped, his signature charisma entirely extinguished. The host of the show, clearly relishing the dramatic turn of events, leaned into the microphone and asked Jason to clarify his previous statements. Jason took a shaky breath and leaned forward. He looked directly into the camera lens, visibly swallowing his pride. I lied. Jason said, his voice flat and reciting the exact script my legal team had mandated. My sister Savannah did not isolate her son from our family. My parents and I chose to cut ties with her 18 years ago. We manufactured the recent allegations of emotional distress because we were desperate. He paused, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second before delivering the final crushing blow to his own ego. I completely mismanaged the family logistics business. I made catastrophic financial decisions that left the company insolvent. We fabricated the narrative against my sister in an attempt to extort a financial settlement from her firm to cover my massive operational failures. Savannah is a brilliant executive, and we are the ones who destroyed our own family. The confession hit the internet like a seismic shockwave. The local business community, which had initially rallied around Jason with sympathy, instantly turned on him. The backlash was immediate and absolutely devastating. The very same institutional investors who had threatened to pull their capital from my flagship tech fund completely reversed their positions. Harrison Caldwell called my private line less than an hour after the podcast aired. He did not sound angry or hesitant. He sounded deeply impressed. Savannah Harrison said, his tone carrying a new level of profound respect. The way you handled a hostile, highly public extortion attempt without breaking a sweat is exactly the kind of ruthless risk management my board wants to see. We are not just keeping our capital in the fund, we are doubling our initial commitment. By the end of the week, 3 other major backers followed suit, pouring unprecedented amounts of capital into the accounts. The public relations nightmare had transformed into the ultimate stress test of my leadership, and I had passed with flying colors. The flagship fund closed with record-breaking capital, cementing my firm as an untouchable force in the competitive private equity sector. Meanwhile, the reality of absolute financial ruin crashed down on my parents. Exactly at noon on Monday, my private security team arrived at the Dallas estate. Thomas and Patricia walked out of the massive front doors carrying only a few suitcases of clothing. They handed over the keys to the property, the luxury vehicles, and the life they had spent decades building on a foundation of lies. The country club board held an emergency meeting that same afternoon, officially revoking their memberships due to the highly publicized fraud and bankruptcy revelations. Their wealthy friends, terrified of being associated with federal financial crimes, stopped returning their phone calls entirely. The people who had attended their lavish parties suddenly pretended they did not even know them. Stripped of their mansion and their social status, Thomas and Patricia were forced to rent a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment in a noisy complex near the highway. The sprawling gardens and private chefs were replaced by thin walls and absolute isolation. They had spent their entire lives obsessing over appearances, and now they had to live with the suffocating reality of being complete social outcasts. Jason suffered perhaps the most poetic downfall of all. Stripped of his golden child status and his corporate title, he was left with nothing but a shattered reputation. The local logistics industry treated him like a pariah. No respectable firm in Texas would even grant him an interview after his public confession of gross financial mismanagement. Desperate to survive and unable to rely on my parents for a bailout, Jason was forced to leave the state entirely. He packed his remaining belongings into a cheap used car and drove to the Midwest. The man who had worn tailored suits, driven imported sports cars, and mocked my teenage struggles eventually had to accept a job as a low-level warehouse dispatcher working the graveyard shift. He spent his nights staring at tracking screens in a dingy, windowless office, earning an hourly wage and taking orders from managers a decade younger than him. His grandiose dreams of corporate domination had evaporated, leaving him to face the crushing, endless monotony of the bottom rung. He was finally experiencing the exact same financial terror and exhaustion he had so gleefully watched me endure all those years ago. The universe had truly balanced the scales perfectly. 6 months passed since the papers were signed in that dimly lit steakhouse, and the frantic chaos of my family's downfall slowly faded into the quiet hum of ordinary, unbothered life. The crisp spring morning air swept across the expansive outdoor terrace of my newly expanded corporate headquarters in downtown Austin. I stood near the thick glass railing looking out over the waking city. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of lightness I had never experienced before. The heavy, invisible armor I had worn for 18 years was finally gone. I no longer needed to protect myself from the ghosts of my past because those ghosts had been completely exorcised. I heard the soft slide of the heavy glass terrace door opening behind me. I turned my head just as Mason stepped out into the morning sunlight. He was wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit, holding 2 steaming ceramic mugs of dark roast coffee. He walked across the wooden decking with the easy, measured confidence of a young man who knew exactly where he belonged. He extended one of the mugs toward me. I took the warm mug, letting the heat seep into my fingers, and turned back toward the skyline. Mason stood beside me, leaning his forearms against the glass railing, mirroring my posture perfectly. The European market reports just came in. Mason said, his voice steady and professional, completely lacking the artificial bravado his uncle used to project. The acquisition we finalized last week is already outperforming our initial quarterly projections by 6%. The board is thrilled. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, bitter flavor. That is entirely because your preliminary risk assessment caught the supply chain vulnerabilities the senior analysts missed, I told him, looking at my son with immense, unfiltered pride. You earned that victory, Mason. It was his first official week working as a junior analyst at my firm. There would be no nepotism, no unearned titles, and no golden child treatment. Mason had to interview with the executive board, pass the rigorous financial modeling examinations, and start at the exact same entry-level desk as every other college recruit. He embraced the challenge with fierce determination, completely rejecting the lazy entitlement that had ultimately destroyed my brother. I was not interested in being handed a legacy. He wanted to build his own. Mason looked out over the sprawling city, the morning sun catching the sharp angles of the surrounding skyscrapers. It feels surreal sometimes, he admitted quietly, his gaze focused on the horizon. Everything that happened last fall. When I think back to that day on the campus quad, when they tried to hand me that vintage watch and buy my loyalty, it almost feels like a movie, like it happened to completely different people. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It feels distant, because it no longer has any power over us. I explained, letting the warmth of the coffee mug ground me in the present moment. Trauma only survives when you feed it with fear or regret. The moment we stripped away their power and exposed their lies, they stopped being monsters. They just became ordinary, deeply flawed people facing the consequences of their own terrible choices. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sunlight slowly illuminate the glass facades of the downtown buildings. I waited for a familiar twinge of sadness or longing for the family I had permanently cut away, but it never came. The hollow space in my chest, where a family should have been, was no longer empty. It was filled to the brim with the deep, unwavering bond I shared with my son. I used to wonder what it would be like to have a massive traditional family, Mason said, breaking the quiet atmosphere. I used to see my friends going to huge holiday dinners with their grandparents and cousins, and I wondered if we were missing out on something important. He turned his head to look at me, his expression softening into a look of absolute respect. But then I watched how quickly that kind of family will turn on each other for $1. I watched them try to throw me under the bus just to save their mansion, and I realized something very important. What is that? I asked softly. Blood does not make a family. Mason stated, his voice carrying the weight of a hard-earned truth. Blood is just a biological accident. Family is loyalty. Family is respect. Family is the person who stands with you when the entire world tries to tear you down. You are my family, Mom. You are the only family I have ever needed. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but they were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. I reached out and rested my hand over his, squeezing it gently. I had built a massive financial empire to protect myself from their cruelty. But standing on this balcony looking at the remarkable, honorable young man I had raised all by myself, I realized that my greatest success had nothing to do with private equity or corporate acquisitions. My greatest achievement was standing right beside me. We built a beautiful life, Mason, I told him, my voice thick with emotion, and nobody is ever going to take it from us. Mason smiled, raising his ceramic coffee mug in the crisp morning air. To the empire, he said. I raised my own mug, gently tapping it against his. The soft, dull clink of the ceramic echoed over the quiet terrace. To us, I replied. We turned back toward the sprawling, sunlit city, drinking our coffee in absolute peace. The noise of the past was completely gone, replaced by the boundless, limitless potential of our future. This was the ultimate payoff. This was the sweetest, most satisfying revenge imaginable. It was not anger, and it was not retaliation. It was just the quiet, unbothered reality of untouchable success. When you are forced to build your own life from the ground up, you learn very quickly that blood does not automatically equal family. For 18 years, I carried the weight of my parents' rejection, believing their inability to love me was a reflection of my own worth. But as I built my empire and raised a son who understands the true meaning of loyalty, I realized something important. You cannot control how other people treat you, but you absolutely control what you tolerate. My family thought they could discard me when I was vulnerable and manipulate me when I was successful. They underestimated the fortress a woman can build when she has nothing left to lose. The greatest revenge is not anger or retaliation. It is reaching a level of success so untouchable that the people who tried to destroy you become nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own future? I would love to hear how you found your strength. Share your experiences in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories about reclaiming your power and building a life on your own terms. Remember, you write your own ending.